How's that old saying go? Is that a CRKT McGlowan designed, deadbolt infused Clever Girl folding knife in your pocket? Or are you experiencing an involuntary period of sexual arousal, creating a divergence of blood to your primary sexual response organ? I may have butchered that. Now, this is the CRKT Clever Girl. This is the new deadbolt lock. My buddy Jeff thought I definitely needed to have a look at a deadbolt locking knife. And looking over the catalogue of deadbolt locking knives, it does seem to me at the moment that they're all on the larger side. And this is definitely a large knife. I wouldn't call this as much of an EDC knife because it is just a pocket knife, a folding knife even. You might not even want to keep it in your pocket. You could even keep this in a sheath. It's that sort of size knife in terms of its length and its girth and also just its general rock and appearance. Look at that. You bust that out at the post office and see what the Nana next door to you does. You might look down and think that she has a CRKT Clever Girl in her pocket. Who knows? But more than likely, she'll be a bit taken aback because this is a quite beastly looking blade. Looking at the designer, you've definitely got Raptor Claw as the mindset. Obviously, the name being a play on the classic Jurassic Park bit. Clever Girl, just before Muldoon, a vastly underrated character, gets eaten by the Velociraptor. He was the only one that was right. He was right the whole time.
They should all be destroyed. Robert Muldoon, my game warden.
And what did they do? They killed him for it. Anyway, Clever Girl, definitely I'm going to say martial concept knife. It's got a lot of grip to it. It's got a lot of big sort of scary, swoopy, slashy blade to it. It's got a devilish point to it. Definitely something to be used in a visceral sense, or at least dreamed about using in a visceral sense, which is where all of us knife guys generally stop things. But anyway, I'm going to take it out. I'm going to use it. I'm going to test it. I'm going to test this deadbolt lock. We're going to see how we feel about the CRKT Clever Girl. Just some basic stuff. It's in D2 steel. This is a hollow grind on this trailing point blade. You've got a G10 handle with lots of milling all over it, and of course the deadbolt lock on that side, and then the other half of the deadbolt lock on that side. You have a flipper or a thumb stud for deployment. The knife runs on washers, I believe. It's not on IKBS. And the action immediately out of the box, or immediately from Jeff, was a little so-so. I've blasted it out with some WD-40, and then I blasted it out with some dishwashing detergent to get out of the WD-40, and then I've blasted it in with some KPL knife pivot lube, which almost smells good enough to eat. I don't know what they put in it, but it's nice stuff. So now it is, with a little bit of occasional wrist, now it's launching where I want it to launch. So doing okay. But overall, I think this is a mid to higher cost CRKT. It's a lot of materials, it's a lot of steel, and it's got their new proprietary lock. I don't quite blame them for that. It's definitely a bit more to it than the CEO, that's for sure. And the D2 steel is, as far as CRKT steels go, one of the better choices available to you if you want to buy a CRKT knife. So there you have it. Let's go see it next to some other knives, and then we will see how this lock works. Might even do some battening with it, and then just some general other comments. It should be a fun little review. Stay with me. looking at the handle, you've got a lot of ridges, you've got, just dropped it and killed myself. You've got a lot of ridges, you've got a lot of gripping points, you've got this sort of retention beak at the back, you've got the forward flipper sort of causing a little bit of a frontal finger guard there as well. You've got some jimping there. It's definitely not designed to fly out of your hand at a moment's notice. It's going to sit in there until you let it go, or if it lets you let it go. It's quite an imposing piece to carry, and that is obviously enhanced by this sort of almost scimitar style blade you've got sitting there, which is great for slashing and slicing. I always find the trailing points a little bit harder for poking with, because I always think that the point needs to be lower than my thumb, but I'm sure you could get used to it. But I always just think a point about there would be great. Just a little bit extra here. I feel like I'm going to be catching stuff there at the front of the blade, but that's just me. Realistically, this is all theoretical use, isn't it? Like, I'm not going to EDC this knife. I'm going to test it for a review, and I'm going to enjoy it as an object. That's how I'm going to use it anyway. You Kevin Clearys out there who like the larger knives, like the the more hand-feeling stuff, like the drama, perhaps, of something like this in your pocket, may have different thoughts. But for me, it's just more of a enjoyment of it as an object that does that, and may cut some stuff should I choose to take it out specifically for that purpose and use it as such. The deadbolt lock is strong. It's very unlikely to develop play, is the best thing about the deadbolt lock, because it relies on, there is two small bits of steel on the back of this going into two exactly matched holes on the blade tang. So often what will cause a lock to start rocking or being manipulated by the forces that you apply to it over time is that it's usually just a thin sheet of steel that will mushroom, or it's like the back of a tang that will start to get worn. This is two holes that you would have to force readjust the shape of. More likely to happen is that they will just shear straight off of this locking arm there, or however you call this, the surface here. On the other side of the surface is rod. So you'd need to shear them off of that, which I guess you could do with complete catastrophic smashing. But again, battening's about the worst thing you'd ever want to do realistically with a pocket knife in an emergency sense for the internet. And as such, it held up perfectly well to that. So I think in terms of durability and longevity, the most likely piece to fail is probably the spring that's holding the button open when the knife is in its open position. So the spring that's keeping all this in there, which you are sort of challenging and overcoming by pushing in the button. But even then, it's all sealed up. It's not exposed like an Axis lock is, so very, very unlikely to happen. I would still say that the Cold Steel Triad lock is most likely the stronger and more high integrity lock, just being that it's simpler, and simpler is always better. This is very simple as well, strength and simplicity they say, but there's still some spring, there's still some, more little tiny parts really than I guess the Axis lock, no, the Triad lock, which is just one rod. Like one rod is the difference. It's a back lock with an extra rod smushed in between the back lock of the spring back lock and the blade tang. So it's hard to describe these things without having them in front of me. So anyway, in terms of overall strength, fun, everything, I rate this lock pretty highly. It is fun to use, especially once you get your blade oiled up and opening and shutting. It's very safe. You don't need to put your fingers in the blade path. You simply just push the blade in, and you can be a nerd and close it with your hand, or you can be a super cool guy and flick it shut and then use your thumb to make sure it's rested in its little happy place. So either way, it's going to be strong. It's going to be safe. It's generally very nicely executed lock. I'm interested to see if they manage to shrink it down particularly effectively, because as you see, it does require a fair bit of space. So obviously this bar here needs to have a blade sort of tang pivot section at least that wide. So yeah, very interested to see the future of the deadbolt lock, but right now it's looking pretty bright. So nice lock there. In terms of carriage, it's a little bit on the clumsy side. It's got a very small deep carry pocket clip, and it kind of bananas back into your pants a little bit. So the pocket clip here sits on the seam of your pants, and most seams of the pants go straight down. So this is kind of like pushing against it, sitting in like that, kind of like, so you do feel like it's taking up a little bit of extra space in your pants pocket as you carry it around. Again, not a knife that I'd probably ever EDC as a day-to-day user. It's just more of something you might have around the house, take out to use if you particularly feel like it, if it grabs your attention on that day. It's a knife, I would say, for collectors and for people who just enjoy all the different sorts of locks and styles of knife more than anything. Not to say that once it's open and cutting things, it's not cutting things very, very well. The hollow grind on this blade is done exceptionally well. It's a thicker stock, so it's about a 3.5 inch, 3.5 millimeter thick stock. So definitely kind of getting towards your paramilitary 2 type thicknesses. Actually, might even be a little bit thicker. It's about as thick as some fixed blades generally are. So, you know, it's getting there. So the hollow ground was a complete necessity, and they've done it very well. And it leads into quite a nice D2 edge, done exceptionally well by Jeff, I must say. It had a end user sharpening job on it, so I'm not sure how these come from the factory. Generally, I find CRKTs come pretty well from the factory, give or take an odd burr here or there. It's just my longer term experience. So pretty strong design overall for what it is, for a big sort of high drama, high impact knife that is probably quite excellent at using to, you know, defend yourself in a close combat environment if you have been trained sufficiently in the use of edge tools and you're up against someone who is clumsily using theirs. It may well be almost puts me to sleep, that line of thought, but it's probably good for that, I guess. Just the hypothetical crisis it causes in me. My brain sort of goes off into the desert of the real to compensate.
The desert of the real.
But really, as an object, as a knife, if you're a knife enjoyer and fancier and collector, it's a pretty good example of a CRKT blade. Nice, interesting designs, giving a leg up to you know, lesser heard of makers. I've never heard of Mr. McGlawn before. You may have. He may be your neighbor and your best friend, and that's great. But I've never heard of him before, so it's cool to see folks like that get their designs in here. You know what? You could do like a little version of this. This is like the sampler, and then you do like a little EDC version of this, and that's the big seller. So who knows? I always like how CRKT do that. Some people knock them for their, you know, general overseas imported nature and their, you know, reliance on the cheaper steels. But I always think a bit like Kaiser, it's that foot in the door for a lot of designers, and it's a really good collector's brand because their knives are generally relatively inexpensive, and you can sample a whole sort of buffet of things. So just my thoughts on CRKT as well. Anyway, another one of these little informal reviews. And I'll see you all in the next video. Goodbye.